The rain had been falling for almost an hour before anyone in the alley behind Brenneker's bakery noticed the woman pressed against the brick wall. It came down soft and steady, the kind of rain that did not arrive with any drama, only patience, soaking everything slowly until the world looked grayer than it had an hour before. A single yellow bulb burned above the back door, throwing a small circle of light onto the wet pavement, and outside that circle, the alley belonged to whatever shadows wanted it. She was kneeling. Her hands were braced against the bricks. Her shoulders were rising and falling in a rhythm that did not match breathing. And then, her knees gave out. She did not fall the way people fall in films, all at once, with sound. She folded. Her forehead touched the wall before her body did, and then her body slid down the bricks until she was sitting on the wet ground with her arms wrapped tight across her chest, holding something hidden beneath her coat. Her hair was dark and plastered to her cheek. Her lips were the color of old paper, and the bundle inside her coat made a small, soft sound. Not a cry. Something quieter. The kind of sound that does not yet know it is a sound. 12 feet away, beside a dark sedan parked at the mouth of the alley, a man in a charcoal overcoat had been holding a phone to his ear. He stopped speaking mid-sentence. He did not move for a full 3 seconds. Then he lowered the phone without ending the call, and the voice on the other end kept talking into the empty air, until eventually it gave up. Because men like Corvin Thrace were used to seeing many things in alleys at night. Bodies. Money. Threats traded in the language of small movements and shorter words. But he had never, in all of his 62 years, seen a woman fold against a wall while trying to muffle the sound of an infant against her own ribs. Even the man they called the quietest hand on the eastern shore could not pretend he had not seen it. The neighborhood was called Linwick. It sat on the southern edge of the river, 3 blocks of low brick buildings that had once been a garment district and were now something harder to name. The bakeries had outlived the factories. The pawn shops had outlived the bakeries. The streetlights buzzed faintly in the wet air as if they had something to say and had forgotten the words. The alley behind Brenneker's was narrow enough that 2 people could not pass without turning sideways. It smelled of yeast and old grease and the particular sweetness of bread dough left to rise overnight. A dumpster sat at the far end. Pigeons had taken shelter beneath it, watching the woman against the wall with the disinterested patience of creatures who had seen worse and survived. This was the kind of place where suffering could happen without being witnessed. Corvin Thrace stood at the mouth of the alley and did not move toward her yet. He looked at the windows of the apartments above the bakery, dark, every one of them. He looked at the sedan idling behind him. He looked at the small figure of the woman pressed against the bricks, and he listened. The infant sound came again. Smaller this time. He slid the phone into his coat pocket. He took 1 step into the alley, and the gravel beneath his shoe made a small wet sound. The woman's head moved a fraction of an inch. She had heard him. She did not look up. She pulled the bundle tighter against her chest and made herself smaller against the wall, the way animals make themselves smaller when they cannot run. He stopped. He understood that geometry. He had seen it before in places he did not let himself remember often, and the recognition arrived now with a force that was nearly physical. He turned his head toward the sedan and lifted 2 fingers. The driver, a man who had worked beside him for 19 years and had never once asked a question that was not necessary, stepped out into the rain and waited. Corvin did not speak yet. He stood at the edge of the yellow bulb's light and watched the woman breathe. And somewhere behind a wall he had built so carefully and for so long that he had almost forgotten it was a wall, a door he did not remember installing began, very quietly, to open. Her name was Mireille Dansbury, though no one in Linwick knew it yet, and she had not spoken her own name aloud in 11 days. She was 27 years old. Her hair was the color of wet bark, cut short to her shoulders, and at one time it had been longer and brushed every night with a wooden brush her grandmother had given her on her 10th birthday. The brush was gone now. She had left it in a drawer in a house she could no longer return to. She had taken almost nothing when she left. She had taken what mattered, and what mattered was breathing softly inside her coat. Her coat was wool, dark green, 3 sizes too large because it had not originally been hers. She had found it folded on a bench at a bus station, and she had taken it because she had been cold and because the inside of it was lined with a soft flannel that made it possible to keep the bundle warm without drawing attention. The buttons did not match. One of them was a small mother-of-pearl button that someone had sewn on in a hurry, and Mireille looked at that button sometimes when she was trying not to cry, because it was proof that whoever had owned the coat before her had also been making do. Beneath the coat, against her chest, wrapped in a hospital blanket she had not been authorized to take, was a baby boy who was 6 days old. His name was Renly. She had named him on the morning he was born, before she had any plan, before she had any fear. She had named him for a bird her grandmother used to point to in the garden, small and brown and ordinary, the kind of bird that survived winter by staying close to the ground and trusting nothing. Renly was breathing. That was the first thing she checked. Every few minutes, with a hand pressed flat against the small of his back beneath the blanket. He was breathing, and he was warm, and his tiny fingers were curled into the fabric of her shirt, with the absolute faith of something that had not yet learned faith could be misplaced. She had been a careful person once. She had braided her hair every morning. She had kept a paper planner with colored pens. She had been the kind of woman who made grocery lists by aisle, who saved receipts, who turned down the corners of pages in books she planned to return to. That woman was somewhere behind her now, in a life she could no longer enter. What was left of her sat against a brick wall in Linwick with $87 in the inside pocket of a stranger's coat, and a 6-day-old infant pressed against her ribs, and the only thing she had been able to think for the last 6 hours was, "Please do not let him cry. Please do not let him cry." Because she did not know who was looking for her, and she did not know how close they were. She had eaten one thing that day. A small carton of yogurt she had bought at a gas station at 6 in the morning, eaten slowly with the plastic spoon held in fingers that would not stop trembling, because she had read somewhere that nursing mothers needed protein, and she did not know if yogurt counted, and there had been no one she could ask. Her body hurt in places that did not have names. Her milk had not come in fully. She had been told at the hospital that this could happen with stress, with what the nurse had called the body's protective response, and she had nodded as if she understood. And she had not understood. And now she understood. And the understanding was a small private grief she carried alongside everything else. Renly made the small sound again. Mireille pressed her cheek against the top of his head, which was warm, and which still smelled faintly of the hospital, and she whispered, "I have you, baby. I have you. I have you," the way her grandmother used to whisper to her when she was very small and afraid of thunder. 12 feet away, the man in the charcoal overcoat had not moved. He stood at the edge of the light and watched her. And Mireille knew he was there, and she knew she should be afraid, and she could not summon the energy to be afraid, because fear required a future, and she did not have one of those tonight. She kept her cheek against her son's head and waited to see what the world would do next. 11 days earlier, on a Tuesday morning that had begun like any other, Mireille Dansbury had walked into a clinic on the north side of a town called Halverston, with her hand on the small of her back, and the sense that something had shifted inside her overnight. She had been 38 weeks pregnant. The clinic was small, and run by a midwife named Coraline Voss. Mireille had chosen the clinic over the hospital because the hospital was on the other side of town, and the other side of town was where her husband worked, and her husband had been very specific about which doctors she was permitted to see. His name was Gareth Dansbury. He owned a chain of 3 auto body shops, and he was 36 years old, and he had married Mireille 5 years earlier in a small ceremony in the backyard of his mother's house, and for the first 18 months of the marriage, he had been a man Mireille recognized. The change had come gradually, the way most dangerous changes come. A comment about her clothing, a complaint about a friend. A long silence after she had spent $40 on a book. The architecture of his control had been built one quiet brick at a time, and by the time Mireille noticed the shape of the building, she was already inside it, and the doors had been moved. Coraline had examined her that Tuesday morning and had said, in the gentle voice she used with all her patience, "Honey, I want you to go home and pack a small bag, because I think you are going to meet your son before the weekend." Mireille had not gone home. She had walked from the clinic to the small park across the street, and she had sat on a bench, and she had begun, for the first time in years, to think clearly. Because Gareth had told her, 3 weeks earlier, that the baby would be raised in his mother's house, that Mireille would be permitted to live there as well, if she behaved, that his mother had already chosen a name, and that the name was Gareth Jr., and that any objection would be considered, in his words, a sign that she was not stable enough to be a mother. His mother's house had a basement. Mireille had been shown the basement once, on a holiday visit, and Gareth's mother had said, with a smile that did not reach her eyes, "This is where the children sleep when they need a quiet night." Mireille had sat on the park bench and thought about that basement, and she had thought about her son, who was not yet born, and she had made a decision that had felt, in the moment, like stepping off a cliff she had been standing on her entire life. She had not gone home that night. She had gone to a women's resource center in the next town over, and she had told a counselor named Esme Holloway everything, and Esme had helped her into a small program for pregnant women fleeing domestic situations, and 5 days later, in a hospital 90 miles from Halverstone, Mireille had given birth to a boy with dark eyes and soft hair, and she had named him Renly. She had been at the program's safe house for 6 days when the call came. Esme had called her into the small office at the back of the building. Esme's face had been pale. She had said, in a voice that was trying to be calm, that Gareth had hired a private investigator, that the investigator had located the safe house, that the program's protocol required immediate relocation, but the next available safe house was in a city 400 miles north, and there was no transport available until morning, and Esme was asking, with her hands trembling on the desk, whether Mireille had anywhere she could go for one night, anywhere that no one connected to Gareth would think to look. Mireille had thought of Linwick. She had thought of it because she had visited the neighborhood once, with her grandmother, when she was 9 years old, to buy bread from a bakery whose name she could not now remember. Her grandmother had died 6 years earlier. No one alive knew Mireille had ever been to Linwick. She had taken a bus that afternoon. She had arrived at dusk. She had walked for 2 hours through streets she half remembered, looking for a bakery whose name she could not summon, until she had found one with a yellow bulb burning above its back door, and she had recognized the smell of yeast and warm bread, and she had known, in the way you know things that come from childhood, that this was the place. She had meant only to rest in the alley for a few minutes, to feed Renly, to gather what was left of her strength. But her body had decided otherwise, and her knees had folded, and the rain had not stopped. And now there was a man in a charcoal overcoat standing 12 feet away, watching her with the kind of stillness that meant he had not yet decided whether he was going to help her or pretend he had not seen her at all. And somewhere, in a town 90 miles south, a private investigator was sitting in a parked car, holding a photograph of her face in one hand and a phone in the other. And the only thing standing between Mireille Dansbury and the basement of a house she had sworn her son would never see was a stranger she did not know, on a Tuesday night in October that the rain refused to end. Corvin Thrace had not become the man he was by accident. He stood at the edge of the light in the alley, and to anyone who had passed him on the street that night, he would have looked like what he was on paper. A businessman of a certain age, a man who owned warehouses along the river, and a freight company that moved goods up the eastern shore. A man whose name appeared on no public registry of anything notable, but whose phone number was in the contacts of 2 senators, 4 judges, and 1 cardinal, who had once asked him a favor that he had granted without ever speaking about it again. He was 62 years old. His hair was iron gray, cut close to the scalp, and his hands were the hands of a man who had spent his early life lifting heavy things and his later life signing documents that moved heavier things at a distance. There was a faint discoloration along the 3rd knuckle of his right hand, where a bone had been broken in 1979 and had healed without being set. And on damp nights like this one, the knuckle ached. And Corvin used the ache to remind himself that he had once been someone the world could damage. The men who worked for him called him by his first name only. The men who worked against him did not call him anything at all, because the few who had tried had found that naming Corvin Thrace in the wrong room had a way of returning to them in forms they had not expected. He had learned, by his 40th year, that a man who has been quiet long enough becomes a kind of weather, and weather does not need to announce itself. He had not always been this man. He had been born in a town called Ardenfell, Pennsylvania, in a row house on a street where the steel mill's smoke had stained the curtains in every window a permanent shade of yellow. His mother's name had been Imelda. She had been 30 years old when Corvin was born, and she had worked nights at a textile plant on the river, and she had been, in every way that mattered to the boy who watched her, the strongest person in the world. She had also been pregnant again, when Corvin was 6 years old, with a child she had wanted very badly and whose father had not been her husband. Her husband, the man Corvin had been told to call father, had not taken this news in the way some men take such news. He had taken it slowly, and with patience, and with a cruelty that revealed itself in increments. He had not struck her at first. He had simply made the house impossible to live in. He had moved her grocery money to a locked drawer. He had unplugged the telephone. He had told the neighbors in his careful and reasonable voice that Imelda was unwell and that she was not to be permitted into anyone's home if she came knocking at strange hours. Imelda had given birth in the bathroom of that row house on a March night in 1964, alone, while Corvin sat outside the door and listened. The baby had not survived the night. Imelda had survived for 11 more days, and then she had not. The cause of death on the certificate had been listed as complications, and no one had asked further questions. Corvin had been 6 years old. He had stood in the front room of that house on the morning his mother died, and he had looked at the man who had been called father. And he had made a promise to himself that he had never spoken aloud to any human being for the next 56 years. The promise had been simple. He would not, in any life that came after this one, stand still while a woman tried to hide a child from a man who would harm them both. He had kept that promise in many small ways and a few large ones, but he had never been tested by a sight as direct as the one in front of him now. And the door he had built behind his ribcage had stayed closed for a very long time, and he had almost believed it would stay closed forever. It would not stay closed tonight. He turned his head a quarter inch toward his driver, and he said, in the voice he used when he was making a decision he was not going to undo, "Brannock, get the back door of the bakery open." Brannock Vey moved without answering, because answering was for men who were uncertain, and Brannock had not been uncertain about anything Corvin Thrace asked of him in 19 years. Corvin took one more step into the alley. The rain ran off the brim of his hat. The woman against the wall did not look up, but he could see her shoulders flinch when his shoe touched the wet gravel, and he stopped where he was, because flinching meant she still had something left to protect, and he did not yet have the right to ask her what it was. He waited. He had learned to wait. He could wait all night if waiting was what the moment required. Brannock Vey did not knock on the back door of the bakery. He produced, from the inside pocket of his coat, a small ring of keys that should not have fit any door in Linwick, and that fit this one, and he turned the lock without making a sound. The door opened inward into a warm yellow light, and the smell of bread, and a woman in a flower-streaked apron looked up from a long wooden table and saw who was at her threshold, and she did not speak, because she had been expecting him eventually for almost 20 years. Her name was Ottilie Brenneker, and she had owed Corvin Thrace a debt since 1998, when her husband had been alive and in trouble, and Corvin had made the trouble go away without being asked. The debt had never been called in. Ottilie had baked bread for 2 decades, waiting for the night the door would open, and Corvin would be standing in it. And now he was. And she nodded at Brannock and went immediately to the small radiator in the corner and turned it up as high as it would go. Corvin had not entered the kitchen yet. He was still in the alley, watching the woman against the wall. He spoke now for the first time, and his voice was low and even. "Ma'am." Mireille's eyes opened. She had not realized they had been closed. "I am not going to come closer. I want you to hear me say that first. I am going to stay where I am, and I am going to tell you what is happening, and you are going to decide what to do with the information." She did not answer. Her tongue felt swollen in her mouth. "The door behind me belongs to a bakery that has been open since 1961. The woman inside has just turned the heat up in the back room. There is a couch in that room, and a sink with hot water, and a kettle. No one in that room is going to ask you any questions. No one in that room knows your name, and no one is going to." He paused. "If you want to come inside and get warm, you can. If you want to stay where you are, you can do that too, and I will leave, and you will not see me again. Those are your 2 choices." Mireille looked at him. Her vision was blurred from the rain and from something else, the deeper blur that comes from a body that has been holding itself together for too long without rest. She saw a man in a charcoal overcoat. She saw eyes that did not move from her face. She saw, without knowing why she saw it, that his right hand was held slightly open at his side, the way a person holds a hand who is trying to communicate that nothing in it is meant for harm. And she saw, beneath the coat, beneath the stillness, something she had not expected to see in any man's face ever again. A recognition. As if he had looked at her and seen, not a stranger in an alley, but an answer to a question he had been carrying since before she was born. She looked down at the bundle inside her coat. Renly was breathing. He was warm. But the rain had begun to soak through the wool at her shoulders, and her own body was beginning to shake in a way she could no longer control. And she knew that if she stayed against this wall for 1 more hour, her milk would not come back at all, and her son would not eat. "Why?" she said. Her voice was barely a sound. "Why are you helping?" Corvin did not answer immediately. The rain ran off his coat. The yellow bulb above the door buzzed faintly. Then he said, "Because my mother once tried to hide a baby from a man who would have hurt them both, and no one in our town opened a single door for her. I have been waiting 56 years to open one." Mireille closed her eyes. She did not cry. She did not have the water left in her body to cry. But something inside her chest, which had been clenched for 11 days, loosened by a fraction. She nodded. Corvin did not move toward her. He waited. He let her stand on her own, because allowing a woman to walk into safety on her own feet was the difference between rescue and another kind of taking, and he had not lived 62 years to confuse the two. She rose slowly. Her legs were not steady. She used the wall to brace herself, and then she used the cold air, and then she used the small warm weight of her son against her chest, which was the only thing in the world that was still asking her to be upright. She walked, one careful step at a time, toward the open door of the bakery. Corvin stepped aside as she passed him, and she did not look at him, because if she looked at him she might fall again, and she had decided she would not fall again tonight. Brannock Vey held the door open, and the yellow warm light of the kitchen fell across Mireille's shoulders, and she stepped inside. Behind her, at the mouth of the alley, a second car had pulled up to the curb without headlights on. Brannock saw it in the corner of his vision. Corvin did not turn his head, but his right hand slid into his coat pocket and did not come out. The car idled at the curb for 11 seconds. Then it pulled away. Brannock and Corvin exchanged a single look. Neither of them said what they were both thinking, which was that the night was not over yet, and that the geography of safety had just changed in ways Mireille Dansbury did not yet know. The back room of Brenniker's was small and warm, and smelled of yeast and clove, and the faint, sharp note of the ammonia Ottilie used to clean her counters. The walls were brick painted white. A radiator ticked in the corner. A green velvet couch sat against one wall, its cushions worn soft from 40 years of bakers sitting down on it during their breaks. Ottilie did not introduce herself. She brought a stack of clean kitchen towels and laid them on the arm of the couch, and she set a kettle on the small stove in the corner, and she went to the cabinet above the sink and took down a tin of butter biscuits. Mireille sat on the couch with Renly still pressed inside her coat, because she could not yet bring herself to set him down anywhere that was not against her own body. Her hands were trembling. Her hair was dripping onto her shoulders. Ottilie laid a towel across her hair without speaking, the way a grandmother might, and turned away to give her privacy. Corvin had taken off his overcoat at the door, and he had sat down at the small wooden table at the far end of the room. He had positioned the chair so that his back was to the wall, and his sightline included both the alley door and the front of the room. Brannock had stepped outside again. He was now standing at the mouth of the alley with his coat unbuttoned, watching the street. Ottilie poured hot water into a chipped ceramic mug and added a generous spoonful of honey and a tea bag of something that smelled of chamomile and ginger, and she set it on the small table beside the couch without comment. Mireille did not pick it up immediately. She did not yet trust her hand to hold it without spilling. Corvin did not speak. He had learned again from his mother that asking questions of a frightened woman was the worst way to learn anything. The questions came when the woman was warm. They came when the silence had been allowed to do its slow work of telling her that no one in this room was going to demand anything from her tonight. After perhaps 10 minutes, Mireille spoke. "His name is Renly," she said, looking down at the bundle inside her coat. "He is 6 days old." Ottilie made a soft sound from across the room and pressed the back of her hand against her mouth, and then she turned back to the stove and began doing something that was not quite necessary, because she did not want her face to be seen for a moment. Corvin nodded once. "May I ask his condition?" he said. Mireille nodded slowly. She unwrapped the top of the hospital blanket, just enough for Corvin to see the small face. Renly's eyes were closed. His breathing was even. His lips were the right color. "He is small," Mireille said. "He was born at 38 weeks. The hospital said he was healthy. I have been keeping him warm. I have been trying to feed him." Her voice caught. "My milk is not what it should be." The nurse said it was the stress. Corvin nodded again. He turned his head slightly toward the kitchen and said, "Ottilie." Ottilie was already moving. She went to the small refrigerator beside the stove and took out a glass bottle of whole milk, and she said, without turning around, "I had a granddaughter who was born small. There is a thing I used to make. It will not replace a mother's milk, but it will hold a baby through one night, and it will give the mother time to eat and to rest." Mireille looked at the bottle of milk. She looked at the woman warming it. She tried to say thank you and could not. "Eat first," Corvin said quietly. "Then we will talk about what comes next." Ottilie brought over a plate. A thick slice of bread still warm from the oven, butter melting into the surface, a small bowl of soup, 2 of the butter biscuits. Mireille ate. She tried to eat slowly, the way she had been eating for 11 days, and she could not. She ate the bread in 4 bites. She drank the soup directly from the bowl. She held the second biscuit in her hand for a long moment before eating it, and Corvin saw her eyes flicker toward the door. The old reflex of a person who has been hungry long enough to begin saving food before they have finished the food in front of them. He said gently, "There is more. You do not need to save anything tonight." Mireille looked at him. Something in her face changed. "Why?" she said again, a deeper way. "Why does a man like you stop in an alley for someone like me?" Corvin was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Because I was 6 years old once, in a town called Ardenfell, and my mother was carrying a child she wanted very badly, and the man she lived with was going to make sure the child did not arrive. I sat outside a bathroom door on a March night in 1964, and I listened to my mother try not to make a sound, and I have spent the rest of my life learning what to do with what I heard that night." Mireille's hand stopped moving. "She did not survive," Corvin said. "Neither did the baby. The neighbors knew. The doctor knew. The priest knew. No one opened a single door." He looked at her, and his eyes were the eyes of a man who had not spoken these words to another human being in 56 years. "I told myself, when I was old enough to understand what had happened, that if I ever lived long enough to be in a position to open a door, I would open it. That is all this is. I made a promise to a 6-year-old boy who deserved better than the night he had, and tonight is the night I keep it." Mireille set the biscuit down. She covered her face with her hands. Renly made his small, soft sound inside her coat, and she pressed her cheek against the top of his head, and she did not cry, because she still could not. But her shoulders shook in a way that was almost the same thing. Ottilie brought over the warmed bottle. She sat down on the couch beside Mireille, and she said, very softly, "Let me hold him while you eat properly. Just for a little while. I will not take him anywhere." Mireille hesitated. The 11 days of her life rose up inside her and told her not to let go. But the warm room said something else. The bread said something else. The man at the table who had named his mother said something else. She unwrapped Renly slowly and laid him in Ottilie's arms, and Ottilie held him with the practiced steadiness of a woman who had held 100 small babies in her life, and she began, in a voice almost too quiet to hear, to hum a song that had no name. Corvin stood up from the table. He walked to the alley door. He looked out at the dark, wet street, where Brannock was standing in the rain with his hand inside his coat, and he saw, 2 blocks down, the same dark car from earlier, parked at the curb with its lights off. He closed the door. He turned to Mireille and said, in the quiet voice he used when he was about to change the geography of someone's life, "I need you to tell me, now, who is looking for you. Because they are closer than you think." Mireille looked at the closed door, and at Corvin standing in front of it, and at Ottilie holding her son on the green velvet couch, and she understood that the answer she was about to give was going to take something from her that she was not sure she had left to give. She gave it anyway. "His name is Gareth Dansbury," she said. "He owns 3 auto body shops in a town called Halverston, 90 miles south of here. He is my husband. He has hired a man to find me." Corvin's face did not change, but his right hand, which had been resting on the back of a chair, slid into his coat pocket and stayed there. "The investigator. I do not know his name. I know he drives a dark sedan. I know he was at the safe house in the next town over before I left." "Tell me about the husband," Corvin said. "Not the abuse. I will not ask you to relive it tonight. Tell me what he wants." Mireille took a breath. "He wants the baby. He told me, before Renly was born, that the baby would be raised by his mother. That I would be permitted to live there, in her house, if I behaved. His mother has a basement. She showed it to me once. She called it the room where children sleep when they need a quiet night." Ottilie made a small sound from the couch. Corvin was quiet for a long time. Then he took out his phone, and he dialed a number he had not dialed in 7 years, and he waited. The voice that answered was a woman's voice, professional and unhurried, and she said only, Yes. Tessily, Corvin said. I need 3 things. I need a verified residential address for a Gareth Dansbury, age 36, of Halverston. I need the name and license of any private investigator currently retained by him. And I need a wire transfer arranged for tomorrow morning to an attorney named Pellingham Rowe. He will know what to do with it. I will text you the amount. The voice on the other end said, Anything else? Corvin looked at Mireille across the room. He looked at the small bundle on Ottilie's lap. Yes, he said. I need a room at the Briarmoor, the corner suite on the 5th floor, booked under the name Renly Adair. Long-term, open-ended. The voice said, done within the hour. Corvin ended the call. Mireille was staring at him. Who is Pellingham Rowe? She said. A family attorney. He has practiced for 41 years. He has never lost a case I have asked him to take. He specializes in protective orders, custodial emergencies, and the dismantling of false reports filed by abusers against the parents of their children. You are not going to pay any of it. I cannot accept. You are not accepting. You are choosing whether to allow a phone call I have already made to do what I have asked it to do. The choice is yours. I am not putting any of this in motion against your will. Mireille looked at her hands. Why? She said. The word had become a small private language between them. Corvin did not answer her with words this time. He went to the wooden table where his coat was hanging, and from the inside breast pocket he took out a small leather wallet, worn at the edges. He removed a single photograph that had been folded in half, and he unfolded it, and he held it up for her to see. It was a black and white photograph of a young woman in a thin cotton dress, standing in a kitchen with bad light. She was perhaps 36 years old. Her hair was dark and pulled back. She was smiling at the photographer, but her left eye was swollen, and she had positioned her body to hide her stomach behind the back of a wooden chair. Imelda Thrace, Corvin said. 1963. Ardenfell, Pennsylvania. 6 months before she died. The photograph was taken by a neighbor who knew what was happening and never told anyone what she knew. Mireille looked at the photograph for a long time. Then Corvin said the line he had been waiting his whole life to say to someone who needed to hear it. I could not be the door for her. I will be the door for you. Ottilie was crying quietly on the couch. Renly was asleep against her shoulder, his small fist closed around the edge of her apron. Mireille did not have any words. She simply nodded. Corvin folded the photograph and put it back in his wallet, and he said, We are going to move you tonight. Not because you are in danger in this room, but because there is a car at the end of the alley that I do not yet trust. The Briarmoor has a private entrance. Brannock will drive you. Ottilie will come with you to help with the baby for the first night. In the morning, Pellingham will call you. From that point forward, you will not be doing this alone. He paused. And the man who is looking for you tonight is going to find, by sunrise, that the geography of his search has changed in ways he did not authorize. Mireille did not ask what he meant. She had begun to understand that with Corvin Thrace, what was not said was always more accurate than what was. The Briarmoor sat on the western edge of the river, an 8-story brick building that had been a railway hotel a century earlier and was now something quieter. The corner suite on the 5th floor had 2 beds, a small sitting area, a kitchenette, and a window that looked out across the river. The door had 3 locks. The hallway outside was carpeted in a deep red that absorbed footsteps. Brannock had driven them in a different car than the sedan, a gray van with no markings, taking a route that did not pass any of the streets the dark sedan would have known to watch. He had parked at the loading entrance at the rear of the hotel, and a night manager had unlocked a service elevator that took them directly to the 5th floor without passing the lobby. Ottilie had carried Renly up in her arms, humming the same nameless song. Mireille had carried nothing. Her hands had begun to shake again, but it was a different kind of shaking now. It was the shaking of a body that had finally been told it could rest. The room was warm. The sheets were white. There was a small basket on the table by the window with bottled water, fresh fruit, a tin of crackers, and a folded note in handwriting Mireille did not recognize. The note said only, "You are safe in this room. Sleep. The morning will bring help." Ottilie laid Renly on the bed nearest to the wall and built a small nest of pillows around him. He did not wake. Mireille stood in the middle of the room and did not move for almost a full minute. Then she walked to the door and turned the first lock. It slid into place with a small definitive sound. She turned the second, then the third. She placed her hand flat against the door for a moment, feeling the weight of it under her palm. The simple fact that no one in the world could come through it without her permission. Ottilie watched her from the bed, and she did not say anything, because there were some moments in a woman's life that another woman recognized without needing to be told. Mireille turned around slowly. She walked to the bed where Renly was sleeping, and she sat down on the edge of it, and she looked at her son's face in the soft lamplight. "I am sorry it took me so long to leave," she whispered. "I am sorry you had to be born into the leaving. I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure you do not remember any of it." And then, finally, after 11 days of holding herself together with both hands, Mireille Dansbury began to cry. She cried the way a person cries when the last of the pressure leaves the body, without sound at first, then with sound. Her shoulders shook. Her hands covered her face. She cried into the white hotel sheets beside her sleeping son, and she cried until she could not cry anymore. And then she cried a little longer, because a body that has not been allowed to cry in 11 days does not stop on a schedule. Ottilie sat on the other bed and did not move toward her, because some grief was not for sharing. She simply stayed, and her presence was the thing that made the crying possible. When Mireille had finished, Ottilie brought her a glass of water. Mireille drank it. "Sleep," Ottilie said. "I will sit with the baby. I will not leave this room. If he wakes for the bottle, I will warm it. You will sleep, and tonight you will be a person who is allowed to rest." Mireille looked at her. "Why are you doing this?" Ottilie smiled, and her eyes were tired and old and very kind. "Because 40 years ago, a man who barely knew my husband closed a door behind a different kind of trouble for us, and I have been waiting 4 decades for the night I could pass it on. Tonight is the night." Mireille lay down on the bed beside her son. She placed one hand flat on his small back, feeling the breath beneath her palm, and within 90 seconds, for the first time since the night she had walked out of the house in Halverston, she was asleep. Outside, 2 floors down, in a small office off the loading dock, Brannick Vey was watching a series of security monitors. The dark sedan from the alley had circled the bakery 3 times before driving away. He kept watching. Pellingham Row called the room at 7 minutes past 8 the next morning. He had a voice like a man who had spent 41 years in courtrooms and had learned how to use silence the way other lawyers used volume. He introduced himself with quiet courtesy, and he asked her to tell him everything, beginning with the first time Gareth had hurt her, and ending with the night she had walked into Brennicker's alley. Mireille told him. The words came in a long, quiet stream, the way words come from a person who has finally been given a listener who does not flinch. She told him about the slow architecture of Gareth's control. The friends pushed away. The phone calls monitored. The grocery money locked in a drawer the way Imelda's had been locked, 60 years and 300 miles away. She told him about the bruise on her ribs in their 2nd year, and the sprained wrist in their 3rd, and the night Gareth had pressed his thumb into the soft hollow of her throat and held it there for 40 seconds before letting go. She told him about the basement, about Gareth's mother, about the moment in Coraline Voss's clinic when she had understood she could not bring her child into that house. Pellingham listened. When she was finished, he said, "Mrs. Dansbury, I want you to do one thing for me today. I want you to write down every incident you have just told me, with whatever dates you can remember. The order does not matter. The details do." By the time I file my first motion this afternoon, I will have built a foundation that no court in this state will set aside. What about the kidnapping report? Mireille said. He has filed one. He has, Pellingham said. He filed it 9 days ago in Halverston. The detective assigned to it has been sent a packet of information by my office at 6 this morning, and I expect, by noon today, that the case will have been quietly transferred to a different file with a different name on it. The name on the new file will be your husband's. And the investigator, she said. The investigator's license, as of approximately 9:45 last night, has been suspended pending review of an anonymous complaint filed with the State Licensing Board regarding 7 years of irregular billing practices. The complaint is, I am told, extremely well documented. The investigator will not be looking for you today. He will be looking for an attorney of his own. Mireille did not know how to respond. She had never been on the receiving end of news that went in her favor. Mrs. Dansbury, Pellingham said gently, you are not going to be doing this alone. You will not be receiving any bills from my office. You will not be receiving any bills from anyone. Your only concern is your son and your own recovery. Are we understood? Mireille whispered. Yes. The protective order was filed by 3 that afternoon. A judge named Honora Kessel reviewed it personally and signed it within 20 minutes. Gareth Dansbury was served at his home in Halverston at 6:15 that evening. He read the order. He read the second envelope, which contained a copy of the kidnapping report against him, now reclassified as a fraudulent filing. He read the third envelope, which was a letter from Pellingham Rowe's office, written in language that was civil and clear and that named, very specifically, the consequences of any attempt to contact Mireille or the child by any means, direct or indirect. What the letter did not say, but what Gareth understood by the time he had finished reading it, was that the world he had been operating in had changed shape overnight. Phone numbers he had counted on did not answer. The investigator he had hired had stopped returning calls. A man whose name he did not know had, somewhere in the silent geography between Halverston and the eastern shore, looked at Gareth's life and decided, without ever meeting him, that it would be smaller from this day forward. Gareth never learned Corvin Thrace's name. He never needed to. He simply learned, the way men like him sometimes learn, that the world contained doors he could not open and rooms he could not enter, and that his wife and son had passed through one of those doors and were no longer reachable. He did not contest the order. He did not file again. He understood in the part of himself that had always understood whether that something quieter than the law had spoken to him, and that arguing with it would not end well. In a hotel room on the 5th floor of the Briar Moor, Mireille Dansbury hung up the phone and sat on the edge of the bed beside her sleeping son, and she pressed her palm against her chest, and she felt, for the first time in years, the strange foreign sensation of a heart beating in a body that was no longer being hunted. The apartment was on the 3rd floor of a brick building on Marrowfield Street, 2 blocks from a public library and across from a small park with a single iron bench and a row of dogwood trees. It had 1 bedroom and a small living room and a kitchen with a window that opened onto a fire escape, and the rent had been paid for the first 8 months by a foundation Mireille had never heard of. She moved in on a Saturday morning in late November. Renly was 5 weeks old. He had begun to make eye contact in the steady way that very young babies do when their nervous systems have decided the world is safe enough to look at. He had a small dimple on the left side of his mouth that Mireille had not been able to see at first, in the alley behind Brenneker's, because his face had still been the face of a newborn. The apartment had been furnished by a domestic violence advocacy organization. A bed, a bassinet, a small couch with a green throw blanket that someone had knitted by hand. A box of books, which had been a gift from Ottilie, who had said when she dropped them off, "Every mother needs books in her house." Mireille walked through the apartment slowly that first morning, holding Renly against her shoulder, and she touched the walls, and she opened every cabinet, and she stood in the middle of the small living room and turned in a slow circle, the way a person does when they are trying to convince themselves that something is real. She walked to the door. She turned the lock. She turned the deadbolt above it. She placed her hand flat on the door, and she felt the same solidity she had felt that first night at the Briar Moor. But this door was hers. The lock was hers. The deadbolt was hers. She pressed her forehead against the wood for a moment. Renly made a small contented sound against her shoulder, and Mireille turned away from the door and walked back into the living room. She laid him in the bassinet. She sat down on the green couch. For the first time in years, she sat down without scanning the room for the position of the nearest exit. She did not know at first what the strange feeling in her chest was. It took her almost a full minute to recognize it. It was stillness. She closed her eyes and she let it move through her, because some feelings only come to people who have stopped running, and the only correct response was to let it stay. Outside the window, a single dogwood leaf, the last one on the branch, finally gave up and fell to the sidewalk below. Inside the apartment, Renly slept, and Mireille sat on her own couch in her own home, and she breathed. 5 months later, on a warm afternoon in April, Mireille Dansbury walked into Brenneker's bakery through the front door for the first time. The bell above the door rang the way it had been ringing for 64 years. Renly was strapped to her chest in a soft cloth carrier that Ottilie had given her in February. He was almost 6 months old now. He had begun to laugh, in the surprising sudden way that babies first learn to laugh, and his small fist was currently closed around the strap of the carrier with the same absolute faith he had once gripped the front of her shirt in a wet alley on the worst night of her life. Ottilie looked up from behind the counter and saw her, and her face did something it did not do often anymore. It opened. She came around the counter without speaking and pressed her hand to Mireille's cheek, and then to Renly's small head. And she said, "Look at you. Look at both of you." Mireille smiled. She had begun to smile again in the last 2 months, in small, careful ways at first, and then in larger ones. "I came to bring you something," she said. She reached into the bag on her shoulder and took out a small framed drawing. It was a watercolor of a small brown bird sitting on a branch with the word Renly written beneath it in soft green letters. "I wanted you to have one," Mireille said, "for the back room, where the couch is." Ottilie took it. She held it for a long moment. Then she nodded, and she walked to the back room, and she hung it on the wall above the green velvet couch, and she came back with her eyes wet but her hands steady. "Stay," she said. "Have something to eat." Mireille stayed. She sat at a small table near the window, and Ottilie brought her a plate of bread and butter and a cup of strong coffee, and Renly dozed against her chest, and the bell above the door rang occasionally as customers came and went, and Mireille did not flinch at the sound of it anymore. Across the street, parked at the curb with the engine running, a long, dark car idled. Inside the car, in the back seat, Corvin Thrace looked through the front window of the bakery and watched a woman he had not seen since November sit at a table with a baby strapped to her chest and accept a plate of bread from his oldest debt holder. He had asked Ottilie to call him on the day it happened, and Ottilie had called him 40 minutes ago. He looked now. He saw the shape of the carrier on her chest. He saw the small fist closed around the strap. He saw the way Mireille tilted her head down every few seconds to check the baby's face. The small private gesture of a mother who had once been afraid to look away and had not yet finished unlearning the fear. He saw, on the wall behind her, just barely visible through the bakery's front window, the framed watercolor of a small brown bird. He sat in the car for almost 10 minutes without moving. He thought of his mother. He thought of the row house in Ardenfell, with the yellow-stained curtains. He thought of the bathroom door he had sat outside of on a March night in 1964, listening for a sound he had been listening for in some way every night of his life since. He thought of the promise he had made to a 6-year-old boy, and he understood. sitting in the back seat of a car on a warm April afternoon in Linwick, that the boy had finally been answered. Not because the world had changed. There were still alleys, and still men like Gareth Dansbury, and still women folding against walls with infants pressed beneath their coats. The world was the same world it had always been. But in one small corner of it, a door had been opened, and the boy behind the wall behind his ribcage, the one who had been waiting 56 years, finally felt the weight of what he had been carrying lift by a single quiet measure, and not all at once, but enough. Corvin tapped twice on the partition. Brannock pulled the car away from the curb. They drove east along the river, into the long, warm light of the late afternoon, and Corvin did not look back at the bakery, because looking back was for men who had not finished what they came to do, and Corvin Thrace had finished. He had opened the door. He had closed it behind her. The lock had held. In the bakery, Mireille looked up from her coffee. She thought for a moment that she had heard a car pull away from the curb across the street. She glanced toward the window. The street was empty. She turned back to her son, and she pressed her cheek against the warm, small head against her chest, and she whispered the only sentence that had been worth 11 days in a green wool coat and a fold against a wet brick wall and a stranger's voice in the dark. "We are home, baby. We are home." The bell above the door rang as a new customer entered, and the smell of bread filled the front room, and somewhere on the wall in the back, a watercolor of a small brown bird hung above a green velvet couch, and the deadbolt on a third-floor apartment 2 blocks away waited faithfully in its locked position, and the world, in one small corner of it, was finally, quietly, exactly as it should be.